July 17th, 1918, the Ipatiev House in Yekaterinburg, and a half-basement room with one barred window and no way out of it. By the time they heard the first shot, the Romanovs had already been dead for 300 years. Most history will tell you what happened in that room. What I want you to know is what got built beforehand that made the room inevitable. Tell it the usual way, and it's a tragedy. A Tsar, his wife, their 5 children, a firing squad in a cellar, and you file the whole thing under murder. That's the myth. And the trouble with the myth is that it's too small for what actually happened. What happened in that cellar was a demolition, 304 years in the making. That family didn't die because of one night in a basement. They died because of a decision taken in 1613, when the first Romanov built a state that was the Tsar and nothing else. No machinery underneath him, nothing that could outlive him or reform itself while he was still breathing. What they built was a throne, and then they spent 3 centuries calling it a state. By the end of this, you won't just know how a dynasty ended. You'll start seeing the same fault line in every empire that ever mistook a man for a machine. And once you see it, you can't stop seeing it. So let me show you how the machine actually worked. Welcome back to Hidden Forces in History. I'm your host, Jeremy Ryan Slate, CEO of Command Your Brand. You can check us out over at commandyourbrand.com. And now, our story. Every machine has an origin, and this one got put together in a ruined city in February 1613 by a 16-year-old boy who did not want the job. His name was Michael Romanov, and the moment he said yes, the countdown started. Russia in 1613 was closer to a wound than a country. It had spent 15 years tearing itself apart because the old dynasty, the Rurikids, had simply run out. One heir after another died or vanished or was never seen again. And when a throne empties with no successor, the state tends to empty out right along with it. They called it the time of troubles. Famine, civil war, foreign enemies moving through Moscow, more or less at will. And at one point, the Kremlin itself was sitting in Polish hands. By the end of it, the Russian state had stopped existing. And I mean that more literally than it probably sounds. Out of that, the survivors made a decision. What they chose to build was a ruler rather than a government, which sounds like a strange call until you understand what they had just lived through. The boyars, the church, the generals who were left. They met in an assembly and they elected a Tsar. Michael Romanov was the least objectionable man in the room. That's the honest way to put it. He was 16, connected to the old line through his great-aunt, who had been Ivan the Terrible's first wife, and backed by a serious faction because his father, Philaret, had one. And on his own, he wasn't powerful enough to threaten anybody who mattered. The men who elected him were looking for a symbol that the country could reform around, and a strong man was the last thing that any of them wanted. So they gave him everything. Absolute authority, divine backing, and no obvious ceiling on any of it. And the next part I want to be precise about, because it matters. The machinery of consultation did exist in 1613. The assembly of the land sat almost continuously through Michael's first decade. His father came back from Polish captivity in 1619 and effectively co-ruled as the patriarch, with the title Great Sovereign. So there are many checks at the founding. They just weren't load-bearing. Nobody wrote them down anywhere. Nobody made them permanent. And within 2 generations, they had quietly withered. Because a state built around a sacred ruler has very little use for a body whose whole job is telling him no. Simon Sebag Montefiore's history of this dynasty keeps circling back to this moment, because everything downstream of it is built on the bargain that got struck here. And this is the part that most histories skip past. That bargain was a survival mechanism. The men of 1613 had just watched what happens when authority gets divided. They had seen Russia drown because nobody could give an order that stuck. So they built the opposite. One man, one voice, one sacred will running down through all of it. And not one of them stopped to ask what would happen the day that man turned out to be ordinary. The dynasty was born out of chaos, so its founding logic was simple enough. Strong aristocracy equals survival. That DNA never left. It was there in 1613, and it was still sitting there 3 centuries later, in a basement in Yekaterinburg. A century goes by and the machine holds, but Russia is falling behind. By the late 1600s, Western Europe has armies and navies and bureaucracies that Russia simply cannot match. And then Peter arrives. Peter the Great usually gets told as the great modernizer, and he was. He dragged the country into the modern world by force. He built a navy, built a professional army, built a civil service, shaved the boyars' beards, and made them dress like Europeans. He built an entirely new capital at St. Petersburg on a swamp, on the bones of the men who drained it, specifically to force the country to face west. All of that is true, but watch what he actually changed. Peter modernized the machinery and left the politics exactly where they were. He never limited the crown, never shared power with anyone. And what he did instead was take the medieval idea of sacred autocrat and bolt it onto a modern state. That contradiction runs through everything that comes after. Modern tools attached to medieval politics. The army and the navy and the bureaucracy all existing to serve one man, rather than a system. Richard Pipes has a word for this, and it's the right one. He calls the Russian state patrimonial, and what he means is that the Tsar didn't govern Russia so much as own it, the way that a landowner owns an estate, the fields and the buildings and the people standing in those fields. In that world, there's no line between the ruler's private property and the public state, because the idea of a public state hasn't been invented yet. Peter made that estate bigger and more efficient, and considerably more lethal, and none of it made the estate any more stable. Because a state that runs on one man is only ever as strong as that man happens to be. Peter happened to be strong. Most of the people who followed him weren't. And the design had no answer for that. Jump forward to the 19th century. Russia is a great power now, but the contradiction is starting to show. Because the country is modernizing underneath the crown. Industry is growing. A middle class is forming. An educated public is coming into being. And the state is still frozen at the Tsar is the state. So the dynasty tries to reform, and then it panics. Then it reverses. And it's that whiplash, more than any single failure, that ends up killing it. Watch the sequence. Alexander II comes to the throne in 1855, gets called the Tsar Liberator, and does the single most consequential thing any Romanov ever did. In 1861, he frees the serfs, 23 million privately held human beings, freed by the stroke of a pen. And he does it because he understands that Russia cannot industrialize with a slave-like peasantry underneath it. He's right about that. And then he gets punished for being right. Reform doesn't quiet the country. It wakes it up. The freed peasants want land. The students want a constitution. And the radicals want all of it and more. And this is where the machine gets its one real chance, or the closest thing to a chance it ever gets. March the 1st, 1881. That morning, Alexander puts his signature to a proposal from his interior minister, Loris Melikov. It wasn't a constitution, whatever people ended up calling it later. It was smaller than that. Locally elected representatives allowed to advise the crown on legislation, an advisory body and nothing more. But it was the first crack in 250 years of the Tsar that answers to God alone. He signed it in the morning. That afternoon, he was riding back from the changing of the guard when a bomb went off at his carriage on the Catherine Canal embankment. The first one missed him. He got out to look at the wounded, and the second one killed him. The proclamation was never published. Sit with that sequence for a second. The Tsar who freed the serfs signed away a piece of his own power in the morning and was dead before dinner. And the bomb didn't just kill a man, it killed the reform. Because the heir drew exactly the opposite lesson from all of that. Alexander III decided that the reform had caused the chaos. So he slammed the door. He turned to reaction, to censorship, to a campaign of Russianification across the empire. And he took a political police force that he hadn't invented, since the security sections had been around since the 1860s, and expanded it into something genuinely new, the Okhrana, working as a nervous system for the state that had decided its own people were the enemy. If you want the full workings of the thing, that's its own story, and I've already told it. Go check out the video. The point here is simpler. Every time Russia modernized, the crown got frightened. Every time it got frightened, it cracked down. And every crackdown built more pressure into a container that had no relief valve on it anywhere. This is where Pipes comes back, because he takes the patrimonial argument all the way out to its conclusion. He argues the autocracy was incapable of reform, and he means incapable in the literal sense, not merely reluctant. Any real reform meant sharing power, and a sacred autocrat who shares power stops being sacred. So the dynasty is trapped. Modernize, and you unleash the forces that destroy you. Freeze, and you fall behind until the outside world destroys you instead. Either way, the clock is running. Which brings us to a man at the end of the line. And here's where you have to be careful with history, because Nicholas II was not a monster, and he wasn't evil. He was a decent husband, a devoted father, a genuinely pious man. He was simply the wrong man for the century that he'd been handed. Russia in 1894 was an industrializing great power. Railroads, factories, an army of millions. And it was being run by a man who believed, with complete sincerity, that God had personally appointed him to do the job. He understood it as a sacred duty, rather than as a work. His diaries are full of it. Pages and pages about the weather, and the walks and the hunting. All threaded through this was the total certainty that he answered to nobody but God. Orlando Figes in A People's Tragedy catches the tragedy of it exactly. Nicholas fought reform because he believed it was a sin, that limiting the autocracy meant betraying the anointing itself. Cruelty never entered into it, which meant bending was never really available to him, so all he could do was break. And the machine he inherited could not run without a strong man sitting on top of it. Nicholas was loyal and gentle and stubborn. And stubborn, it isn't the same thing as strong. This is the Ibn Khaldun pattern, and it's the spine of this whole channel. 5 centuries before Nicholas was born, a North African judge and his exile sat down to work out why dynasties die, and it produced the best answer that anybody has ever given. His argument is that dynasties run cycles. The founding generation is hardened by struggle and has real cohesion. Sabaya is his wording for it, because they built the whole thing with their own hands, and they remember what it cost them. Their heirs inherit a kingdom instead of building one, and every generation after that is a little softer and a little further from the founding struggle, until the 3rd or 4th generation is sitting on a throne it didn't earn and it doesn't understand. Now, Ibn Khaldun's clock runs fast. He thought a dynasty burned through its cohesion in about 4 generations, roughly 120 years, and the Romanovs ran for 304 years, and 18 rulers. I'd argue that stretch is the interesting part, rather than a hole in the theory, because the Romanovs kept resetting the clock. Peter reset it by force. Alexander II reset it by reform. Every time the cohesion ran out, somebody with enough will dragged the whole apparatus forward another century, which works right up until the man on the throne has no particular will of his own. The founding generation had been hardened by the time of troubles. The men who elected Michael had watched a state die in front of them. Nicholas, 3 centuries downstream, kept a diary about the weather. Whatever cohesion the dynasty was born with had fully dissipated by then, and the only thing left holding the state together was the exact thing that made reform impossible, which was the sacred man himself. Except now, the sacred man was ordinary. First real crack came in 1905. The war with Japan went badly. The economy strained. And on a January Sunday, workers marched to the Winter Palace to petition the Tsar. They carried icons. They sang hymns. They wanted the father to hear his children. And the soldiers opened fire. The official count came in around 130 dead. And nobody believed it. Most historians put the real figure closer to 200 killed, with several hundred more wounded. And by the time the revolutionary press was claiming thousands, the number matters less than the thing everybody agreed on, which was that the Tsar's soldiers had shot the Tsar's petitioners in front of the Tsar's palace. It became known as Bloody Sunday. And the way that works is subtle, so stay with me. The Tsar wasn't even at the palace that day. He was out of the city, and the shooting was ordered by nervous officers on the ground. But in a personalist state, everything flows to the man anyway. Every grievance, every demand, every bullet ends up on the Tsar's doorstep. Because there's no institution standing between to absorb any of it. In a constitutional state, the blame spreads across the government, and a parliament and a prime minister. They resign, and the system keeps going. In Russia, there was nobody to resign. There was only ever the Tsar. So Bloody Sunday became Nicholas's personal sin, and the whole country rose. Strikes, mutinies, peasants burning manor houses. And for a few months, the empire very nearly came apart. So Nicholas did the thing his father had refused to do, and he conceded. The October Manifesto, a parliament called the Duma, civil liberties, limited constitutional rule. And that's the fatal move. Because in a personalist state, a concession reads as a confession of weakness rather than a compromise. The sacred autocrat blinked, and the moment he blinked, the spell broke. Because his entire authority rested on the claim that his rule was absolute and divine. The second he shared any of it, he admitted it wasn't. And you can watch him trying to have it both ways in the actual paperwork. 6 months after granting a parliament, the new fundamental laws were issued to define how the system would work, and they still described his power as autocratic. The word is sitting right there in the document. He wanted the concession and the divinity at the same time. Biggs puts it plainly. The manifesto satisfied nobody. The revolutionaries read it as too little. The conservatives read it as far too much. And the Tsar himself read it as a temporary embarrassment to be reversed the first chance he got. So the Duma was granted, then undermined, then dissolved, then re-granted, then rigged. A parliament that only exists when the crown allows it is a stage, and everybody watching understood that. The half reform ended up stripping legitimacy from the crown instead of stabilizing anything. And the lesson in that is brutal. A sacred ruler can rule absolutely, or he can fall. And sharing simply isn't on the menu. There's no middle position anywhere. Nicholas spent the rest of his reign looking for one. Then come the Accelerants. And this is where the popular story gets the casualty backwards. The usual version says 2 things killed the Romanovs: Rasputin and the war. Neither of those answers is wrong. They just stop about 2 layers too early. Take Rasputin, a wandering Siberian holy man, although wandering rather undersells the work involved, because he spent years climbing through Petersburg society, vouched for at every step by perfectly respectable people. Until around 1905, he reached the imperial couple themselves. The healing came later. The heir, Alexei, had hemophilia, and Alexandra was desperate. And when the boy nearly died at Spala in 1912, and a telegram from Rasputin got credited with recovery, the relationship stopped being a curiosity and turned into a dependency. So he stayed, and he gained influence, and he scandalized the court. And the story that comes down to us is one of a debauched mystic corrupting a weak czar. But notice what the story quietly assumes. It assumes the state was so personal that a faith healer could turn into a national security problem. In a functioning system, Rasputin is a gossip item. In a personalist state, he's a crisis, because there's no institution standing in the way to keep him out. And notice how long the approach took, and how many respectable people opened doors for him along the way. Calling that a security failure gives it too much credit. There was nothing there to fail, because nobody had ever built anything, because the court was a family, and the state was a family. And a family runs on who has the ear of the father, which is the whole point. What Rasputin did was reveal the shape of the collapse, rather than cause it. If you want the full workings of the man and what he actually was, I've got a whole video on him. Go check it out. For now, just hold the pattern that a state which is one family can't keep a stranger out of the family business. And then the war. World War I is usually where the historians put the blame, and Russia wasn't ready for it. Something like 15 million men called up over the course of the war, the largest force any nation put into the field on either side. Food shortages, inflation, and the Tsar personally taking command of the army in 1915, which meant leaving the capital in the hands of his wife and Rasputin. All of that is true. But the war didn't break Russia so much as remove the last of the excuses. A modernizing economy running on medieval politics, asked to fight a total war that demanded the mobilization of society. That's the formula. And the war made every term in it lethal. Ivan is careful here, and so am I. The war worked as an accelerator on something that was already going to happen. Take the war away, and the fault line is still sitting there. Because the gap between a modernizing society and a frozen crown was going to snap eventually. The war just made it snap sooner and harder. February 1917, and it happens faster than anybody expected. Bread riots in the capital, the garrison mutinies, and within days the entire apparatus simply stops obeying. And here's a detail worth sitting with. Trotsky, writing his History of the Revolution years later from exile, insisted that nobody organized February. He said the parties didn't do it, the exiles didn't do it, and neither did he. It began from below, and it happened by overcoming the resistance of its own revolutionary organizations. Now, Trotsky is writing about his own revolution, and he has every incentive to make the whole thing look like history rolling downhill towards him, which is exactly why that admission is useful. The man with the strongest possible motive to claim credit is telling you there was nothing to take credit for. The regime just stopped being obeyed, and there wasn't really a fight to lose. Nicholas, coming back by train from the front, can't even get home. His train gets diverted to Pskov, and his own generals tell him the only thing left is to abdicate. And this is the moment the entire argument lives or dies. In a constitutional monarchy, when a king abdicates, the system absorbs it. A successor steps forward. The parliament carries on, and the state bends around the gap. In Russia, there was nothing to step forward. Nicholas abdicated in favor of his son, then changed his mind within hours, after asking a doctor whether the boy could survive being separated from him, and named his brother Michael instead. And Michael didn't take it. He issued a statement the next day, saying he'd accept the crown only if an elected assembly offered it to him. And that assembly didn't exist yet. It never did make the offer. So 304 years of the Romanov dynasty ended in a railway carriage with a pen, and then a deferral to an institution that had never been built. The crown fell, and there was nothing underneath it to catch it. No legitimate parliament, no constitutional monarch, no law capable of holding the country together, without a sacred ruler sitting in the middle of it. That single afternoon is the whole argument. The Romanovs fell because the state underneath them was empty, and how strong the Bolsheviks happened to be is almost beside the point. Remove the man, and there's nothing left. And vacuums in history don't stay empty for long. Somebody fills them. And with 8 months, it was the Bolsheviks. And the whole family was now sitting in their custody. Which brings us back to where we started, the Ipatiev House in Yekaterinburg, July of 1918. And before we finish, there are 2 things the record demands we get straight. First, the number. The dynasty ruled for 304 years, 1613 to 1917, and that's measured to abdication. The family spent 1 more year as prisoners, so the walk down to the basement came 305 years after the first Romanov took the throne, 304 years to the fall, 1 more year to the bullet. The countdown ran 3 centuries, and the last second of it was a cellar. Second is the myth. For decades, people believed one of the daughters had survived, Anastasia specifically. A dozen women claimed to be her, and there were books and films and an entire industry built on the idea that the princess got out of that cellar. It was a comforting idea, and it was false. And we know what happened in unusual detail, because the man who ran it wrote it down. Yakov Yurovsky, the commandant of the house, dedicated an account for the Bolshevik archives about 2 years afterward, and it reads like a logistics report. He's irritated about the jewels. He's irritated that the disposal took all night and went wrong twice. It's the most detailed source that we have for that night. It's the killer's own paperwork, written for his own side, with no reason on earth to soften anything. On the night of July the 17th, the family was woken and told to dress. They were led down to a basement room, Nicholas carrying his son, because the boy was too ill to walk, and they were told it was for their own safety. Then the firing squad came in. Nicholas died first, then Alexandra, then the daughters, who had sewn their jewels into their clothing, and whose deaths took longer because of it. Then the boy, then the servants who had stayed with them. The bodies were taken out and stripped and burned and buried hidden. That's the mechanics of it. And it reads as a demolition rather than a tragic romance. And here's why I keep using that word. A murder kills people. Demolition takes down a system. The Romanovs were killed for what they represented, and what they'd actually done barely entered into it, because the Bolsheviks were erasing the possibility of restoration, which is a very different job from executing a threat, which is why they killed the father and the mother and the 5 children and the family doctor, and the cook, and the maid, and the footman. 11 people in one room. So the symbol could never come back. That's what a one-man state leaves behind when it falls. No loyal successor, no loyal parliament, no loyal institution anywhere that might have kept the family alive. Just a symbol and a cellar, and the need to make the symbol disappear. The bodies stayed hidden for decades, and this is the next detail that tells you everything about the Soviet century. The grave was found in 1979. 2 men, a geologist and a filmmaker, worked backwards from Yurovsky's own account, located the site, opened it, lifted out 3 skulls, and then got frightened. They put the bones back, and they told nobody for 12 years, because the state that ordered the killing was still in power. The official exhumation didn't come until 1991. In 2007, the last 2 bodies, Alexei and one of the sisters, were found separately a short distance away, and the DNA closed the case. Experts still argue about which of the younger 2 daughters was in that second grave. And it doesn't matter for the question anybody was actually asking, because across both sites, every member of the family is accounted for. There was no survivor. Anastasia died in that basement with the rest of them. The myth was kinder than the truth, and the truth is the whole point of this channel. So here's the part you were promised, the part you can't unsee once you've seen it. The Romanovs are a pattern much more than their Russian story. Every system that modernizes its economy, while freezing its politics around a single person, builds the same fault line into itself. And it doesn't matter what century you're in. That ideology is running, or what the man at the top calls himself. Tsar, president, chairman, strongman. The label changes, and the machine underneath it doesn't. Ibn Khaldun saw it 600 years ago in the dynasties of North Africa. Pipes renamed it in the structure of the Russian state. Livan saw it in the imperial archives. Figs saw it in the streets of Petrograd. And it's running right now, in states all over the world. The formula never changes. You industrialize, you educate, you urbanize, and you create a middle class that wants a say in things. And then you deny it say, because the sacred man cannot share power. That's the pressure sitting underneath all of it. And the pressure always releases the same way, because a state with no institutional shock absorber snaps instead of bending. The Romanovs are just the cleanest and longest and best documented version of it. 300 years of warning, played out in slow motion. Same playbook, different century. And so we end where we began. An empire that runs entirely on one person is a countdown, much more than an empire. You've heard me say that about Alexander. The Romanovs are the same machine running in slow motion, 3 centuries long. The founding was the first tick. Peter tightened the spring. The reformers wound it. And Nicholas ended up standing in the middle of it. A gentle man who couldn't see the machine his ancestors built was never going to survive an ordinary person sitting at the center of it. And in the end, destroying the Romanovs only took the removal of one man. The revolution barely had to do anything, because there had never been anything underneath him. Just a throne they'd agreed to call a state. This has been Hidden Forces in History. I'm Jeremy Ryan Slate. Please like this video, leave us a comment, and smash that subscribe button if you want more Hidden Forces in History.